So hi everyone, thank you for joining us and welcome to this discussion on NPS, wittily entitled MP Yes or MP No. My name is Heath, I'm the Managing Director of Blue Yonder. So we have a focus as a business on innovation, but we're also quite a practical inside company. We like to get things done and we like to do the right thing basically. So debates about metrics and things like NPS are very interesting to us. So that's why we're here today to talk it through. It's become quite a controversial topic over the years, so I'm really looking forward to the next half an hour or so talking about it with Chris and Marshall and Suzanne and see where we get to, see if we can answer the question, is NPS a valuable metric or not? But before we get into it, I'll just let everybody introduce themselves. So first, at random from my screen, Chris, would you like to introduce yourself? Tell us who you are, who you work for, and tell us one thing you love about market research.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, I'm Chris Carr. I'm a customer insight manager at the airline EasyJet. And why do I love market research? I suppose it's just always different. You never know what the next project's going to be. In any sector really or category, I think there's always something new around the corner. And the amount of ways that you can get to some sort of truth in quote marks, that's the exciting part. It's like in a movie when someone's tooling up to go and fight the challenge that faced them, and picking those tools is really interesting. So it's always a new challenge.
Love that. Good analogy. Feeling more empowered as a market researcher already. Thank you. Marshall?
Yes, I'm Marshall Kramer. I'm the marketing research manager for Anglia Education. And in terms of research, what do I like about it? I would say it's one of two things. It's finding ways to improve a process or something that we're creating at our company, and also kind of the gratification that I get supporting my colleagues. So they'll come to me and say, hey, we need to figure out the answer to X, Y, and Z, and kind of putting a plan in place to help address that for my colleagues, for the senior level within our company, or whoever it may be. I enjoy that.
Fantastic. And Suzanne?
Hi everyone, I'm Suzanne. I've had about 20 years experience working client side in companies like ITV, eBay and Rightmove. And in the last couple of years, I've been running my own consultancy called Fathom, which picks up overflow projects for overstretched client side teams, but also I work with lots of startups that don't have a formal research function yet. And the reason I love research is quite similar to the other two, really. There's never a day when you don't learn something new. Just as you think you understand people or you understand how to do research, something new comes along and just keeps you learning every day.
Brilliant, thank you. And I should say for myself as well, that on a personal level, for me, it's always about the practical side of things, just like helping people make decisions, which is why this debate appeals to me so much, because it's always the case that you can, used in the right way, things can be positive, and used in the wrong way, they can be negative, I think. So yeah, that's my interest. So Suzanne, let's kick off. Can you just, anyone who may not know what this NPS thing is we keep talking about, like what actually is it? Let's start there.
Okay, so NPS stands for Net Promoter Score, and it's basically a question that's commonly used in research, and it's aiming to measure the relationship between a brand and its customers. And it asks the question, normally something along the lines of, would you recommend this brand or service to a friend or relative? And you score it on an 11-point scale ranging from 0 to 10. If you score a 9 or a 10, you're classified as a promoter. If you score 0 to 6, you're a detractor. If you're 7 or 8, you're a passive. And the Net Promoter Score is derived from subtracting the detractors from the promoters. But it's a concept that was brought to our attention probably over 20 years ago by a guy called Fred Reichheld, who's a management consultant for Bain, I think, or McKinsey, and it was published in the Harvard Business Review and sold to the world as the one number you need to know. And in that paper, he'd established a correlation between NPS scores and growth.
I know that all three of you have used it or had some interaction with it. So just tell us a bit about your experiences using the tool.
I think NPS is kind of everywhere. I mean, everywhere I've worked, it's appeared to some extent or another. Probably my biggest experience with it was when I was at eBay, when they were very keen on it indeed. In fact, there was a global excellence team whose job it was to run a global NPS program, and they would literally NPS anything. I mean, it wasn't like, does it move? Well, NPS it, but every aspect of the eBay experience, whether it was checkout, sign in, would get an NPS score attached to it. And it was also a measure that was used in the stakeholder incentive scheme. So then it'd be, so lots of it going on, and they travel the world and produce hundreds and hundreds of reports. So that's kind of my biggest experience of it. I think what's interesting about that NPS team at eBay is it wasn't part of the research team at all. It was separate, and the people that worked it weren't researchers. They were probably more consultancy types. But eBay was very keen on it, and we'd have Bain over once a year to the San Jose campus for a 2-day extravaganza on NPS. So it's very much ingrained into the culture of the business.
How about you, Chris?
Yeah, so I've seen a couple of different uses of it, and I think this is probably one of the key points here, is that context is partially key. How people use it varies wildly. Suzanne's already mentioned a few ways. So in a previous role, it was used more as a benchmarking exercise against competitors. And then currently it's more of a point in time score that's taken from customers, a sample of customers that might have travelled with us over a period of time. I think that general point of context and the sheer variety of how, where, why companies use it is something that's probably going to become sort of central to this conversation, I think.
And Marshall, how are you using it? How have you used it?
Yeah, so I would say the first kind of 10 to 12 years of my career, I didn't really have that much exposure to NPS. I worked with a lot of FMCG, hospitality brands, and we just didn't integrate into NPS that much. About 5 years ago, joined Nord Anglia, and I inherited a bunch of projects that were already existing and integral to our business. And in our parent satisfaction survey, which goes out each and every year, we already had a would you recommend question, but it was a yes, no. So we had the question right, but not necessarily the scale. So that's something that we tried to build into, hey, let's change the scale 0 to 10 point, as Suzanne mentioned earlier. And that actually, it took some convincing, indicating or talking everybody in our organization, whether it be principals or the leadership of our organization, this is what we're going to be able to get out of it. So yes, we'll still understand what they recommend, but we're going to get more granularity in the data. We can classify them into promoters, detractors, or passives, and you're going to be able to have some open-ended questions to get even more depth. So it's something that has now become a very crucial part of our satisfaction survey that we send out each and every year. It's the one bit, I would say it's the one KPI for us. So very important for today's discussion. It works really well for us in education.
Okay. So I won't be able to resist a few jokes throughout all this. We do have some detractors and promoters about NPS on the call itself. So let's get into it. Why is it so controversial? I think anyone who's worked in market research for more than a few years will have heard people go, "Oh, NPS or NPS." Why has it become so controversial, do you think?
I mean, for me, it goes back to where it started and the time in between. I think marketers are always and businesses are always looking for the simplest way of measuring their performance. So you just have that single number and you can look at that and say, well, we're doing well or we're doing poorly or we're getting worse or we're getting better. And there's been several examples of those over the years. And this was a really big one. And it grew in popularity, I'm sure, no doubt, due to the marketing of it, ironically, by the people who developed it. Over that period, though, its attempts to validate it have failed, basically. So it's become clear that the original research, and as admitted by Fred Reichheld himself, was poor. Any attempts to validate that have not come off well. So I think there's been, but in that time period, lots of people still use it. So they're sort of stuck in this place of, well, maybe they don't know that it's not really showing what it's supposed to, what it was claimed to.
Like Chris, I think it's been really well marketed, and amazingly, not everyone loves numbers. And so for people that aren't, overtly numerate, having it simplified in that way is great. But I think there's a difference between being simple and being a bit simplistic. I have no issue with recommendation. I think to Marshall's point, I think, I can't imagine a more important decision to make than where to send your child to school. So recommendation is incredibly important, but it's whether the NPS measure is the one that you'd necessarily use to do that, because I sent my son to a private school, so I've been through that decision. And if somebody said, would you recommend the school I sent him to? I would say, well, if you're asking me whether he got the academic achievement he could have got given the material they started with, I'd probably say no. Did they help me deliver a kind of well-rounded, sociable, level-headed human being? Absolutely, yes. So there's kind of an always it depends underneath that recommendation question, which the metric in itself doesn't capture. So used on its own, it's a bit limited.
So is the issue really more about how it's used and validated in companies rather than the fact that 10-point scale recommendation question, which could seem quite uncontroversial actually?
I actually think that the 11-point scale is part of the problem, because what you get is a composite number, and composite numbers aren't in themselves particularly helpful. You know, your NPS is derived from taking one thing from another. I mean, it's a bit like me saying to you, the median age of people in Lithuania is 45. What health services would you provide for them? It's not enough information on which to know what's going on under the surface. So, you know, you can get the same NPS score from different configurations if you want to. So I'd say there's even a little bit of a flaw with that. That said, it's a tracking metric. So what you're looking for is movement. But I think that is almost the start of the problem sometimes, in that, particularly when you have stakeholders we had at eBay, where that metric isn't moving, people start to sometimes question whether it's the one they should be paying attention to.
Just expand on that a little bit. What are the specific issues with from a research point of view, the science of the scale? Talk us through them.
So one issue with a scale would be it's fairly arbitrary bucketing in terms of the 9 and the 10 were chosen as promoters, for example. So there's huge cultural differences that occur that perhaps in America, you know, they might be very kind of yee-haw about things and say that's great, and actually that would be very different in a more conservative country. Perhaps British people might say, well, it's not so great, and an 8 might be very good for a UK respondent to that question, whereas actually in the US, for example, it could be the 10 is what you want. So those buckets are kind of a bit strange. You've got the issue of course, if you, let's say at the extreme, you have 50% of your people that are scoring at 0, you could increase all of those to a 6. Let's say you ask them again 6 months later and they all increase to a 6 as a result of the things that you'd done, initiatives that you'd made. That would not change your NPS score, assuming everything else stayed the same, because 6 is still a detractor. So that's a couple of things.
Just to add on to that, when we adopted or we refined NPS within Nord Anglia, we had a lot of principals who were asking about this. They're like, well, why is this parent a 7? Why are they passive? Why aren't they a promoter? And what we were trying to tell them is that, look, this is just it's a metric. It's we already asked the question. It's important to what we want to understand. We're just going to be able to get a little bit more data out of it. Yes, parents, they may say 8 one year, 7 the next year. Of course, they'll fall on that scale that we use. But what we can leverage on is the deep dive questions of, why have you rated this? And that's what's most important, at least for us at Nord Anglia, is having the principal being able to sit down and see. So somebody who says a 7, they may have very positive things to say about the school, and then they can kind of take that into consideration of what's happening. Yes, at the end of the day, you're still going to get your NPS score, but they can read the comments and kind of understand the tone or what's happening amongst the parents at the school.
You touched on a really important distinction there, Marshall, which is the difference between NPS, which is the score, and Net Promoter, well, not even Net Promoter, but the system, which is the kind of expansion, if you like, that Bain and company developed to say, well, this is now, we look at more deep things and build it into the business and be customer focused. And that side of it, absolutely great. That's where the richness is, looking at why people are saying, I would recommend or I wouldn't, which in many cases is a proxy for their satisfaction.
So devil's advocate, if you have a country benchmark, you have ongoing tracking, so you know relative history and what a good score is and a bad score is, does it really matter whether there's a flaw in the metric, or is actually the NPS metric really dangerous, and could it lead to the wrong conclusions? What do you guys think?
It can be flawed, but I wouldn't dismiss it for that, because it's a tracking metric and therefore those flaws are consistent over time. I think where it can become dangerous is if people rely on that rather than doing the right kind of research. I'll give you quite an extreme example, but last June, I was forced to travel with British Airways, and it was just after travel had been decriminalised. And so it was a little bit chaotic. And I arrived at Heathrow Airport, and everyone, wherever they were travelling to, and remember every country at that point would have different entry requirements around vaccines and testing, all put into the same holding pen where we all stood for 90 minutes until it got to the point when it was going to be, risk we might miss our flight, and we'd have to, get dragged out of that queue, taken to the check-in desk, and on we went. And basically, it was the worst flying experience I've ever had. And I got the obvious survey from British Airways after my flight, and it included an NPS question. And they'll have got my feedback a few weeks after that flight. Now, the reality is, if somebody from British Airways had actually done my flight with me, they'd have learned as much about what was right and what was wrong with that experience as they ever could have done. But they were using an NPS score to capture my experiences. It kind of felt like I could have told them immediately what was wrong and given them suggestions as to how to make it better, but they relied on a survey question aggregated with several thousand other people's answers that they probably report back a while later to try and understand what the problems were. So I think if you're doing NPS as a surrogate for something else, you might want to rethink it.
So we've got issues with it as a scale. We've got issues with it with the validation of it. What it's trying to get to. So what are the positives? So obviously there's a couple of things that have already been mentioned. So we mentioned that it's easy, simple, it's repeatable. So all of these things appeal not just to researchers, but to CMOs and CEOs. But what else behind it? There's a drive for customer centricity, isn't there, and the system. So have you seen that really add value? Have you seen this thing work?
Yeah, I mean, I think it works really well for us. I mean, I know there's been a lot of challenges to NPS, but I mean, from a management point of view, we're always asked, or that there's some type of KPI that we need to kind of identify to help us understand the business. Richard, as you mentioned, it's simple, it's easy. So we were able to implement it on something that we were already using to get a little bit more granularity out of data that we were already kind of collecting. I know Chris has mentioned that, yes, you don't have to really ask the NPS question to get some of the same metrics, but it does kind of work for us. And I think one thing that we really like is we have a school level benchmark. We use the regional level benchmark, and then we have a kind of a global level benchmark. So some of the flaws, and as Susan has rightfully mentioned, hopefully that is mitigated by the fact that we're tracking it over time. So it does help us to kind of understand, okay, this particular market, let's say it's the Americas. Yes, we know there are cultural differences. They interact or they answer more positively than other regions. But when they're comparing versus their region versus their school each and every year, it works for them. So for us in our situation, especially kind of premium education, where we're really focused in on loyalty and advocacy, we think that it works well.
I think the NPS's greatest gift to market research is actually it's a metric that is now in the boardroom. And I think we should see that as an amazing opportunity. Which other metric, maybe brand health, ever makes it to a board meeting, possibly. So I think in that sense, and just opening up the whole debate around consumer centricity and measuring how our customers feel, I think it's been brilliant. Personally, I haven't worked in a sector where I felt it's been really helpful, and I've actually worked in sectors where it's been singularly unhelpful. So Rightmove is a classic example of a market where it just isn't appropriate. So at Rightmove, we'd NPS estate agents. Now, if you're an estate agent trying to make a living in the UK, you have to be on Zoopla and you have to be on Rightmove. Without those two platforms, you can't really exist. And so to ask an estate agent whether they'd recommend Rightmove to another estate agent, it's kind of a bit of a moot point. Why would they? And so we used to get quite a schizophrenic response when we ran it, where you'd get estate agents giving us a 10 and then saying really horrible things about us, or the opposite would happen. They'd give us a 0 and say, yeah, it's really fantastic. I love this new tool you've just created. So there are definitely places where it doesn't work. And I think that's where, you need to kind of go back to the drawing board and start thinking about what you do need to measure to give the business some proper insight.
So I've been fortunate enough to participate in a lot of different types of research, speaking with different parents. And it's quite amazing to figure out the kind of the purchase journey that the parent goes through. So with us, we're located 30 different countries, 80 different schools around the world. So you have a lot of parents who may be sitting somewhere in Europe and they find out tomorrow that they're moving over to Asia to relocate with their company. they're not really familiar with this experience. So how are they going to go about getting their child into a school in this new country? Everything really relies on what are other parents saying. So they'll go onto Google or whatever social media platform, try to answer that, understand that. And it's all coming from parents. It may be different forums. They may get connected with other parents. Maybe their company has somebody, a relocation agent, that kind of puts them in touch with the right people, but it's all word of mouth. So for us, everything is so reliant on word of mouth, we think that, you know, NPS, being able to measure that is quite important for us, because we want to make sure that, you know, if we have our parents at our schools, they're happy, saying very positive stuff, as other parents are potentially relocating or whatever their situation may be, it can help influence that, and at least we're having that positive word of mouth.
I have one other question to you all as client-side professionals. Say that we have to use it, the CEO insists. Like, what are the guide rails you would put on? What advice would you give people to make sure it's not damaging and the wrong decisions don't get made?
You know, if you're working within an organization and everybody's talking about NPS, I mean, I do think that the industry that you're in, and the nature of your business is really important. You know, you can't just force fit NPS into any situation. It works well for us. We tend to like it, but I think, you know, it's a highly emotional decision for parents purchasing or deciding to put their child into premium education. It works really well. Is it perfect? Probably not. I don't think NPS will be perfect for anything, but I don't know if there is a perfect metric for any company for each KPI. But there are, you know, in my previous experience, 10 plus years working with clients, I never used NPS for any of those, because there are definitely some industries, some companies out there, it just doesn't make sense. So if you were in a situation, and Suzanne, you know, this is what you were saying, you would want to challenge that and be like, you know, I really don't think that this is fit for purpose for what we need to get out of this.
I know some people will be watching this because they'll be hoping for, okay, so what is it then? Have you seen any? What are the best metrics that you would recommend, or is it purely a case of, as you've said a few times already, it depends on what you're trying to measure? Have you seen anything that you would recommend?
I'll just jump in and say, honestly, it just depends, because I think it's going to count on what is the nature of your business. What are you trying to measure? I mean, I can't just sit there and say, oh, I would go with this, it's going to work for everybody. It will not. The three of us are trying to illustrate that, you know, it kind of works for us. It doesn't really work for Chris. Maybe Suzanne has had some good experience with it, maybe not. But yeah, it's not something, I don't think there's any metric out there that you can say this works for everybody.
I do have a metric that's quite good. The one metric that I find quite reliable is in brand tracking. Spontaneous first mention always has quite a strong relationship with market share.
And that comes to mental availability,
Yeah.
at a point of, you know, of the Ehrenberg Bass Institute, and that connects, of course, with advocacy, because why is that brand top of mind? Part of it is marketing, part of it is experience, part of it is word of mouth, and understanding the balance of those sorts of things will give you an idea of how important something like NPS or another advocacy measure should be in your armory of questions and metrics. Not necessarily that it's the biggest thing or the smallest thing, but whereabouts that lies is hugely helpful then in terms of how you prioritize it.
Yes, I was just going to add on to what Suzanne was saying. Yeah, I completely agree with the spontaneous awareness. I think it's a really important metric. I had a short stint at a company over in Singapore that really focused on behavioral science, and that approach, integrating that into research. I found it fascinating after many years of, you know, kind of traditional agency research going into this. If you take a FMCG, let's say some type of soda drink, for example, Coca-Cola may be the most well-known, but when you go into the convenience store, maybe that other product is just in a much better location, and you're just on autopilot going in and you grab whatever. So it may be important, but there's other things that can influence it as well. So I think it goes back to it depends. It really just depends.
And that's the physical availability bit, isn't it?
Yeah,
exactly.
You know, if it's in the right place, then it has an increased chance as well. So it's all that, the combination of those things for sure.
And then that also plays back to the early work from Anglia Ehrenberg around brand loyalty, which said there's no such thing, but consumers generally have a portfolio of brands from which they're happy to choose. So he did that work in FMCG, he did it for breakfast cereals, he did it for TV actually as well shortly afterwards. So yeah, this notion of true loyalty, and this notion that we can be truly loyal to a packet of wheaty bangs when we can't even be truly loyal to our friends is just one of those kind of subjects that gets bandied around quite a lot, which I don't entirely buy into.
I love that we've spiraled onto how brands grow, because I was thinking of a way to bring this up, just to compare and contrast Bass Institute, how brands grow with the Net Promoter Score system. Because just to throw it out there, to an extent they come from the same place. They're trying to simplify marketing and simplify decision making. They're trying to appeal to the top tiers of businesses. Do they have similar strengths and weaknesses? Is the Ownberg Bass work sullied by the same sorts of troubles, or not? How do you compare?
I would argue that how brands grow in the Ownberg Bass research isn't trying to simplify marketing. It's trying to illuminate it and to help us understand actually what's going on in the necessarily complex, interconnected things that happen when somebody's thinking about buying something. There's a lot happening, and they have evidence to show where there are these commonalities and these sort of laws. So I'm not sure it's trying to simplify it.
Let's zoom out a little bit. We've got a bit more time. A rough quote from the original paper was, like arguing for why we need NPS, was normal surveys are complex, long, and involve black boxes. So that's part of where NPS came from as a response to that. So we've established that we don't think NPS is the be all and end all. So what do you think market research and what do you think the industry needs to do to address the challenges which led to NPS rising in the first place?
I think, yeah, there's always been a problem with things like engagement with surveys, right? As you've just said, there's issues with, it's surprising how many examples of poor survey practice we see, despite the existence of, bodies like the MRS. Too long surveys, questions worded poorly, input methods not being engaging, using the same thing as you go through, all those things. That's the sort of stuff that if you can be really concise, get to the point, if you need to rotate questions so that you're not asking everything of everyone all the time, there's ways to do that, and good agencies, good practitioners will be able to guide you down that route. And I don't quite know what drives the sort of poor practice, if it's just people doing it themselves in SurveyMonkey, and that probably happens more than we would care to admit, that people who aren't research specialists will be creating a survey because someone's asked them to do so, and it could be a small business and they don't have people like Suzanne helping them, and they just do the best they can and make questions up themselves that are worded not very well, and they don't understand the nature of wording a question in a survey is incredibly important and not an easy thing to do.
Yeah, I'm quite brutal when it comes to writing questionnaires. I mean, I question every question, but I'm not really sure whether the problem's coming from client-side people or agencies, but I do think some of it is definitely coming from not really having a really clear idea of what it is you're trying to answer in a survey. There are too many, we'll just ask that because it could be interesting, or we asked that last time, even though it's got no real relevance. I think then there needs to be a better, more systematic approach to doing a survey and being confident that actually you can get what you need to know in 5 questions and you don't need all the other stuff. What was interesting a couple of years ago, I'm quite heavily involved in Aura, the client-side research organisation, and we started an Innovation of the Year. And the people that won it in the first year was Flood & Partners, and it was for their really engaging, clever way to get people to answer surveys. It's called the Honesty Box. It just used techniques to get nearer to the truth than you could. And it surprised me that with all the flashing nods of technology out there, that something that really just took us back to basics, put the customer or the respondent at the centre of something, was decided to be the most popular new innovation amongst people that do this stuff. So I think there's a real need and opportunity for us all just to be reminded sometimes. I don't drive, but I understand that some people don't drive exactly the way they were taught how to drive, and we all get into bad habits. We'll make our surveys too long-winded or sometimes completely painful for respondents. So I think that there's a lot of work that we could be doing there to encourage us better practice in terms of questionnaire writing.
So yeah, really interesting. I think just and thank you, by way of wrapping it up then, what would your final thoughts be on the subject of if people are watching this this discussion and their questions, so how do I figure out what drives growth for my business and how should I go about measuring that? What do you think we've learned? What are your final thoughts on that?
I think the overall conclusion is that it depends. You know, there is no quick fix, and that's why it's really important that we think about what the business is trying to do and continue to measure what matters and make sure that we get that bit right. And it may be different for everybody, but I think just to keep thinking about it, keep questioning is the way to do your job.
Yeah, I think you have to go back to why. If you were to build up from the bottom and just strip everything out that you have in your measurement stack, where would you start? And you'd start by asking, what do I need to measure and why do I need to measure it? And then what's the best way for me to measure that? And if by some sheer fluke or a happy accident NPS comes out as being, once you've read up about NPS and all the other metrics, of course, if that comes out as being the best way to do it, then happy days, go for it. I suspect that'll be limited cases, and I think Marshall's case is possibly one of few where it might be relevant. But always just ask why, and that's the best place to start.
I recently had a work experience student who was in our Nord Anglia office, and he got to work with some of the different departments and spent some time over with me. And what I was explaining to him is, you know, you come into an organization, especially if you're a researcher, you've got to talk to everybody. You need to understand all of the challenges, all the questions that are going to happen. I would say my recommendation or my advice is, while you're doing that, while you're going through that process, you've also got to be very careful, because everybody's going to want to track something. They're going to have some question. Everybody has KPIs, you know, if you're digital, comms, brand, whatever it may be. And you've got to remember, okay, what's going to be that experience for the end user, whoever's going to take that survey and answer it. You don't track too much. So I think it comes back to full circle of, well, that's why we kind of tend to lean on NPS, because everybody wants to know something, but we're trying to simplify it as much as we can. Is NPS the right thing for everybody? Of course not. I think we all agree 100% there. Just find out what works best for you.
All right. So I think it was really, really interesting conversation. As always with these things, you could probably continue on and probably sketch out a series of further podcasts that it's inspired, because it raises so many questions. But Suzanne, Chris and Marshall, thank you very much for taking part. And I hope everyone watching has found it useful and it's raised some good questions for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.